The wiggle dance, initial observations and experiments. Von Frisch carefully detailed the behavior of bees when they returned to the hive after finding nectar at faraway locations. On the vertical side of the honeycomb, returning bees performed a waggle dance consisting of a straight run during which the abdomen is waggled back and forth and ending with a turn to the right or left to circle back around and start the run again. After each run, the dancing bee alternates right and left turns such that the dance forms a figure-8 pattern, figure 12.3. Other bees at the hive encircle the dancing bee, making contact with their antennae. After observing the dance, many other bees are observed to leave the hive and find food at the location previously visited by the dancer, leading to the assumption that the dance is a signal to the location of the food. Figure 12.3, a bee performing a waggle dance. During the run, the abdomen is moved back and forth, ending with a turn to the right or left to circle back around and start the run again. The angle of the dance in relation to the vertical corresponds to the angle of the food location to the sun's azimuth angle, labeled as 40% in this figure. Given that the food source can be over 100 meters away, it seems amazing that such a simple dance can convey distinct information regarding a particular location. Different elements of the dance, however, appear to contain information relevant to the distance and direction of the food source. The distance to the food is conveyed by the length of the run and the duration of the dance. The angle of the dance run to a hypothetical vertical line drawn on the honeycomb corresponds to the angle of the food location to the sun's azimuth angle, labeled in figure 12.3. Other cues to the food are conveyed by the odors of the food remaining on her body. The initial research by von Frisch included experiments designed to examine whether bees that observed the dance truly used the information to find the food location, figure 12.4. To test whether receivers, often called recruits, use information regarding direction, certain bees were marked and trained to find food at a feeding platform. During training days, the food was a weakly sugared solution that did not elicit dancing back at the hive, but on testing days, the solution was made much stronger. One platform was baited, but control platforms were also placed in the environment, each equidistant, but set at different angles from the hive. After the marked bees visited the strong solution at the training feeder, they returned to the hive, danced, and the recruits subsequently arrived at the correct location, suggesting that they had learned information about direction from the dance. To test for distance information, a similar experiment was conducted, but now the platforms were set up in a line from the hive, such that the angle was identical, but the distances differed. Again, though, recruits looked for food at the correct platform. Figure 12.4. The arrangement of platforms during von Frisch's study of the waggle dance. The dances appeared to contain information about the direction of a food source. Recruited bees were more likely to visit the baited platform than control platforms. Although von Frisch's experiments seem to be compelling evidence that bees use information from the dance to indicate the location of food, controversy and debate abounded. When bees dance, the motion is often stopped, and the dancer regurgitates small amounts of the food. This, and the odor cues from the dancer's body, may be all that the recruits are using to find the food. Outside of the hive, a possibility supported by Wenner et al. 1967. Wenner, 1967, further proposed that the sounds made by the movement of the dancer's wings carry the information regarding the distance to the food. The alternatives to von Frisch's account of the honeybee dance language were not without merit, but as will be seen in the following section, subsequent studies have shown conclusively that bees do use information from the dance to find food, though they may not rely exclusively on it. The waggle dance. Subsequent experimental support. Strong support for von Frisch's claims came from Gold, 1975, who incorporated a novel experimental design that, in effect, caused dancing bees to misinform the recruits. The overarching logic was that if recruited bees show up to a location that was indicated by a dance, yet no food is actually there, then it cannot be said that recruits solely use environmental cues such as odor to lead them to a location. Gold based the experiment on the fact that bees in dark hives dance according to the vertical, as described above, but bees in bright hives dance in relation to the source of light. Further, after covering some bees' light-sensitive ocelli, they would behave as if they were in the dark. That is, bees with covered ocelli would dance according to the vertical, but the potential recruits in the bright hive with normal uncovered ocelli would interpret the dance as angled relative to the light. These recruits subsequently search for food at the misinterpreted direction, indicating that the dance itself is indeed used as communicative information. Further evidence comes from work by Kirshner and Town, 1994, that utilized an artificial Model B. Because experimenters could manipulate the Model B, they could systematically observe which aspects of the dance event were used by recruits. When the artificial bee danced, dispensed small amounts of the food, and vibrated its wings, recruits left the hive and searched at the indicated location. When any of the three elements were missing, fewer bees were recruited to search for the location. Thus, all aspects of the dance may be important. Features like the sound and vibration might encourage bees to attend to the dance and help them determine the dance orientation. The dance itself conveys distance and direction information, and the odors may influence recruiters as they near the location. The waggle dance. Cognitive mechanisms. The cognitive mechanisms underlying dance behavior appear to include aspects of spatial cognition. Dancing bees provide straight-line information in relation to the food, yet their own search was likely circuitous. Thus, dancers may use path integration to encode and report the location. Receivers appear to read the dance, but there is also suggestion that their prior experience in the environment can override dance information. Given prior experience, receivers can match odor from the dancer to memory of the source location in the environment. Note that this does not discount theories of the importance of bee communicative dance. It simply suggests that bees may not always need to rely on the information. The dance behavior of bees has often been referred to as a language, though it may be more appropriate to refer to it broadly as a communication system. When compared to the features of human language, it could be argued that bee dance has situational freedom, in that the dance relates to a location that is not currently perceived. Yet, as noted earlier, situational freedom in human language is not limited to just experienced events or locations. Because recruits respond to the signal in the absence of the stimulus that elicited it, there is evidence of functional reference. However, the reference appears to be a location, as dances can recruit observers to visit food sites or even potential nest sites. In contrast, studies of alarm calls, to be discussed in the next section, have found evidence that different signals can be used with specificity for different predator species. Alarm and food calls. The relatively limited signal set that characterizes most animal communication includes calls that are elicited by predators and food sources. These calls tend to be species-specific, and at least in the case of alarm calls, do not appear to show regional dialects like bird song. The learning and context of these calls has been the focus of research both in the wild and in laboratory settings. Of particular interest has been whether the calls may be considered functionally referential, how the calls are learned, how specific the calls may be to particular reference, and, relatedly, how the receiver represents the call, e.g., do calls simply elicit an appropriate behavior, or do they elicit a representation of a particular type of food or predator? Many species engage in food and alarm calling, but here, focus will be placed on a few particularly well-studied species. Alarm calling in vervet monkeys. Vervet monkeys live in troops in savanna areas of southern and eastern Africa. They give 3 different sounding alarm calls to 3 types of predator: leopards, eagles, and snakes. Figure 12.5. To do so, adult vervets must make fine distinctions among bird species, as calls are not given to non-predators like storks and vultures. Though young vervets begin to make the calls at a very young age, the ability to discriminate among predators appears to develop over the first 4 years of life. Infants, for example, may give eagle alarm calls to harmless objects in the air. Yet, These young vervets already show some discrimination. The eagle calls are seldom given in response to terrestrial predators. The first years of life, thus, appear to provide learning experiences that allow the alarm call system to be tuned to appropriate threats. It is likely that observing others use the calls provides experience for learning, e.g. via observational conditioning, Chapter 13, though there is no evidence for direct teaching by older members of the group. Figure 12.5. Sonograms depicting the alarm calls of one vervet monkey. Behavioral responses of receivers differ according to the call type. Oh wow, it's literally showing like the sound waves, like I guess the sonogram, they're totally different for the three types of calls, like extremely different. The behavioral responses to each of the three calls differ too. After a leopard call, for example, receivers climb up trees, but after snake calls, they look around on the ground and, at times, mob the snake. Receivers respond to eagle calls by looking up and often running for cover. To test if these responses were truly elicited by the calls and not personal observation of the predator, Seyfarth et al. Conducted a field experiment in which pre-recorded calls were played back from concealed speakers, a playback experiment. Because calls were played back when there were no actual predators present, any responses would be based on the call itself. For each type of call, the response was appropriate, suggesting that these calls show functional reference. However, playback experiments alone cannot determine why the calls are effective. Do the calls simply elicit particular responses, or do they have meaning and elicit the representation of a particular predator? Both are likely supported by associative learning mechanisms, though distinguishing between the possibilities helps to elucidate the content of signals like alarm calls. Seyfarth and Cheney, 2003, suggests that the alarm calls activate representations of the predator, a proposal based on a series of studies. In Zuber-Blur et al. 1999, for example, one finding was that monkeys did not alarm call in response to the sound of a predator if they previously heard a conspecific alarm calling for that same type of predator. It is possible the alarm call elicited a representation of the predator such that the subsequent sound of the predator required no new calls. In contrast, when the sound of the predator occurred after a conspecific alarm call for a different type of predator, vervets did alarm call after hearing the predator. Attention to other species alarm calls. When one species lives in close proximity to another, there is the potential to learn associations between another species' calls and the events, e.g. presence of predator, that elicited the call. Diana monkeys, for example, respond with alarm calls to the alarm screams of chimpanzees with whom they share a common predator, leopards, but they do not respond to the social screams of chimpanzees. Learning to distinguish between the chimpanzees' screams is adaptive for Diana monkeys. The monkeys can benefit from the chimpanzee alarm screams, even if no conspecifics have seen the predator. Further, remaining quiet when chimpanzees are engaging in social screaming makes the Diana monkeys less conspicuous to the chimpanzees, which are also one of their predators. Attention to other species' alarm calls can also lead to deceptive signaling. In particular, when a species is capable of vocal mimicry, it can learn to produce the alarm calls of another species, and subsequently also learn that production of the mimicked call affects the behavior of members of that species. For example, fork-tailed drongos, a bird species, mimic the alarm calls of other species, e.g. meerkats, when they are handling food, which causes the other animals to flee and leave the food unattended. Figure 12.6. The drongos are then able to steal the food. Even actual drongo alarm calls, i.e. not mimicry, can elicit fleeing in sympatric species if members of those species have learned the drongo calls. Drongos appear to take advantage of this by also producing their own calls, i.e. false alarms, before stealing food. Figure 12.6. A fork-tailed drongo. Drongos mimic the alarm calls of other species, as well as producing their own species-specific false alarms, which allows them to steal the food of fleeing members of other species. It is likely that deceptive alarm calls are effective because the cost of ignoring real alarms outweighs the cost of responding to false alarms. It is also the case, though, that deceptive signals can become ineffective via the process of extinction if they are used too frequently in relation to real calls. Pied babblers, for example, did not abandon food after hearing playbacks of drongo alarms, a call also frequently used in false alarms. Yet, the pied babblers did abandon food after playback of the drongos mimicking another species' alarm. It is possible that vocal mimicry is adaptive in this case because it allows species to have a variety in false alarm calls, which in turn may weaken the process of extinction. Food calls. Calls made in association with food have been reported for many primate and bird species. The costs of potentially having to share or give up a food source to conspecifics who hear the food call are thought to be outweighed by various benefits, including the social recruitment of group members so as to lower predation risk or take over defended food, attraction of potential mates, the enhancement of inclusive fitness by attracting kin, or the display of high status. As with alarm calls, researchers have been interested in determining whether food calls can be classified as functionally referential. Some of the strongest evidence for functional reference in food calls comes from chickens. After discovering food in the presence of a hen, roosters emit a specific vocalization that has an acoustically distinct structure. When these calls are played back to hens, they look to the ground as if searching for food. Further, if the hen hears the call just after eating a few kernels of corn, she engages in significantly less searching behavior, suggesting that the calls do elicit a representation of food, yet provided no new information since the hens were already aware of the food. A logical concern is that the hens were simply satiated, but too little food was provided for this to explain the results. Readers of Chapter 4 may find the logic of this experiment similar to that of devaluation experiments that distinguish between SS and SR associations. Other strong candidates for functional reference are chimpanzee and bonobo food barks, which are grunt sounds that can vary in pitch. In playback experiments in a captive setting, chimpanzee and bonobo participants spent more time looking for food at a feeding site after hearing food barks than when no sounds were played. More specifically, if they heard barks that were produced in relation to a high-quality food, they searched at a location where high-quality food had previously been found. In contrast, they searched at a low-quality food location after hearing barks produced in relation to low-quality food. However, Clay et al. 2012 note that since the subjects were originally trained to find high or low-quality food at these locations, it is possible that the detection of caller arousal led to search behaviors at locations of matching arousal for the receivers, not the representation of a particular type of food. In fact, these authors suggest that many studies of food calls may not provide conclusive evidence regarding functional reference because calls may simply work to recruit others based on general excitement and not an expectation of food. Systematic studies with other species that are based on the work of Evans and Marler with chickens, however, may ultimately provide more information about the nature of food-associated calls. Communication in play behavior. Play is a behavior that many animal species engage in, but has proven difficult to define. One oft-cited definition is the following by Beckhoff and Byers, 1981. Play is a motor activity performed postnatally that appears to be purposeless, in which motor patterns from other contexts may often be used in modified forms and alter temporal sequencing. If the activity is directed toward another living being, it is called social play. Yet the authors of the definition and other researchers studying play acknowledge its limitations. Two primary concerns are that the definition could arguably include such behaviors as pacing, and that the function of play is not considered. What appears to be accepted, though, is that play is an important behavior during development, and the behavior includes multiple play-specific communicative signals. In this section, The function and signals of interactive social play will be discussed. The function of play. It is commonly thought that play provides training in physical and social skills that are needed for survival and reproduction as an adult. In bighorn sheep, for example, adult males compete aggressively for females. As juveniles, male bighorn sheep spend more time in play than females, and this play consists of contact like headbutting and pushing, which is preceded by stereotyped movements. In chimpanzees, play has been hypothesized to provide skills that will be relevant for later coalition forming. In humans, play has been studied extensively, and similar to proposed functions of play for animals, it is thought that play is integral to cognitive and social development. As the educator Maria Montessori famously said, play is the child's work. A particularly well-studied form of social play is referred to as rough and tumble play in humans, and in animals, it is typically called play fighting. Juvenile rats that have been deprived of interactions involving play fighting with peers have been found to develop various deficits in social competence, even if other types of social interaction were possible during development. Further, Panksepp and colleagues have found that play fighting in rats elevates levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a growth factor, in the amygdala and dorsolateral frontal cortex, suggesting that play might program brain regions involved in emotional behaviors. In humans, boys engage in more vigorous, rough and tumble play than girls, a difference that appears to be universal across human cultures. Girls do engage in some rough and tumble play, and higher levels are related to levels of prenatal testosterone in both boys and girls. The period of development in which human rough and tumble play between children and fathers is most common appears to correspond with the development of frontal lobe functioning, which supports the regulation of behavior and emotion. It remains unclear whether the developing frontal lobes make rough and tumble play possible, or if play provides experiences relevant to brain maturation, but further comparative neuroscience studies appear warranted.